Okay, let's get started. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone. My name is George Costandi, and I will be the moderator today for you. We welcome you to Origin and Cause's webinar titled Unique Challenges of Investigating Fires in Extreme Cold. So I just want to go through a couple of quick points with you. By now, you should have clicked on the GoToWebinar link so that you're signed in and your attendance is accounted for, so you can receive a completion certificate after the webinar is done. Please stay signed in. Do not close GoToWebinar until we have concluded the webinar. You should be viewing the webinar, or you can view the webinar after we're actually going to be recording this and posting it on YouTube and LinkedIn. So in case you have to drop off early, at least you're aware that that will be available to you. There will be a Q&A period at the very end of the webinar, so just make sure that you're inputting your questions on this little panel here. You could see the questions section, so please submit your questions. And make sure that you join in on the conversation on Twitter at origin_cause. So let's get started, and I would like to introduce our speaker to you. So today we have Mazen Habash, who is joining us to discuss this topic. He is the president of Origin and Cause. He has over 30 years of industry experience and has conducted over 3,000 forensic investigations. He's an electrical engineer as well as a computer engineer. His specialties are fire and explosion investigations, electrical failures and malfunctions, product liability cases, alarm system investigations, and security camera video extraction. Without further ado, here is Mazen.
Well, welcome and thank you for joining us. This morning, while getting ready for this webinar, I thought I would look at the weather across our country. And of course, we're in winter. Unless you're at the very west coast in Victoria and Vancouver, you are in the midst of some sub-freezing conditions. So let's get started. In northern regions, extreme cold poses a major obstacle for field adjusters and fire investigators. Temperatures can drop to -50 degrees Celsius with a wind chill. Frostbite can occur in less than 10 minutes. I know from personal experience, working in extreme cold conditions adds a whole new dimension to examining a scene, and it can be very uncomfortable. This, of course, introduces some challenges to the field adjuster and the fire investigator. We will be discussing some of these challenges in this webinar. So some of the considerations that we will talk about is clothing, transportation, logistics, and client expectations. Under extreme cold weather, everything at the scene, to the basic equipment, is impacted and affected. Clothing, transportation, and logistics need to be carefully planned and considered. Even you and your client's expectations need to be managed differently. So let's talk about the state of the scene. The condition of the scene depends on the structure itself, the nature of the fire, and the fire suppression tactics that were used to suppress the fire. Here's an example of what I would call an ice castle. It's basically a fire that's destroyed a building and during suppression is now encased in ice. At -40 degrees C, everything can be encased in an ice thickness of anywhere between 5 and 8 centimeters. In some areas, even more, up to 30 centimeters thick. This makes it difficult to access the structure. It actually presents several safety hazards that we'll discuss later on. Just walking up to the building can cause a slip hazard. Can also cause structural collapse and falling ice. Ice can provide reinforcement for a building that is about to collapse. So the ice itself can reinforce a structure that is imminently compromised. Or the excessive ice weight on an overall structure could undermine its integrity and result in a collapse. So you, as an adjuster that's attending a site, need to be very careful to assess the integrity of the building, as does the forensic engineer or the fire investigator or a contractor, before entering to make sure that it is not hazardous. Some of the things that you need to look at is make sure that there's no downed electrical lines or poles, or any ice hanging from the roof that might fall on you when you're entering and exiting the building. Again, consider the excessive weight of the ice on floors and walls. Footing inside and out of the building could be quite dangerous when you're approaching. Frozen stairs are particularly hazardous, especially if ice is obscured by fire debris and not readily visible to you as the adjuster entering for the first time. In basements where water from fire suppression typically collects, the ground might appear solid, but one wrong step can send you through ice into freezing water up to 2 to 6 feet deep. Personally, I've experienced that. I've actually fallen through an ice surface into the basement up to my waist in freezing water. I've had to be able to climb out with my camera equipment and other tools that I've had with me. This is in very cold temperatures. And of course, you have to make your way to your car and find a way to get changed into dry clothes. And when it's extremely cold and windy outside, that is not a comfortable thing to do. The challenges that firefighters face in cold weather may affect the physical damage to the building. This impacts insurers because these incidents tend to become larger losses due to the cold weather challenges of fire suppression. Delayed or ineffective suppression due to inclement conditions, failed pump burst apparatus, buried hydrants, or frozen hoses might result in more extensive and more widespread damage than one would expect under less harsh winter conditions. In this photograph, you can see that there are firefighters and they're trying to thaw a fire hose. In fact, one of them, the one standing, is got a propane torch that is using to create conditions where the fire hose can be thawed out. Again, that causes a delay for fire suppression and may impact you, the adjuster, in the size of the loss that you are adjusting. Okay, under normal circumstances, you can make preliminary determinations at a scene. However, when everything is covered in ice, evidence becomes that you're relying on must be extracted carefully and taken to the lab or staging area to thaw out. Typically, as fire investigators, we end up taking a large amount of evidence from the scene for examination so that it's thawed and can be following inspected, most of which ultimately is discarded as being immaterial to the fire cause. In other words, we spend a lot more time removing items to examine because they're obscured by frozen ice or water. And once we've actually examined it, we realize that it's not material to the cause of the incident. Okay, we're going to talk about other challenges. Extremely difficult to confirm or eliminate electrical wiring as a potential cause when the wiring is encased in ice. Evidence of electrical arcing damage, for example, or melting cannot be readily identified visually unless the ice on the wiring is thawed. The other thing that we worry about is that the ice typically makes wiring very brittle under cold conditions. As with any investigations, sometimes evidence needs to be removed from the site and placed in evidence bags. These bags become brittle and break easily. Even using a zip tie to close the evidence bag sometimes is challenging because these plastic materials will break or snap during use. So now that we have addressed our challenges with ice, how do we overcome these challenges? Ice can prevent you from examining a room or evidence buried under frozen debris. You, the field adjuster, may be unable to document the contents in a room when the room is partially covered in ice. To avoid damaging contents further or damaging potential important evidence, the ice must be melted before things can be examined or removed. How you accomplish this depends on the scene and what your resources are that are available to you. The location of the scene may dictate which equipment is locally at your disposal for such an examination. So in this photograph, we have two main systems that we use for heating so as to provide the thawing process for a frozen scene. The first one is the salamander heater, which is shown in the photograph, and the other one is the glycol ground heater, which I'll discuss in a minute. So salamander heaters are often used on construction sites and are great for heating spaces inside a building. As the temperature in the room starts to warm up and the ice begins to melt, you can begin removing layers of frozen debris, exposing contents for the field adjuster to document or potentially important evidence for the fire investigator to consider relating to the cause of the fire. Depending on the ice thickness and the condition of the scene, this can take several days. So a consideration in terms of how quickly things get done at the scene and what the cost of investigating the fire is. In the photograph, you can see a salamander in action. The tarp is being used to hold as much heat generated by the salamander heater into the space or room of interest. As you can see in the picture, the heater is sitting outside of the building. Flexible ducts are being used to direct the hot air from the salamander heater into the room of interest itself. You can also see in the photograph that a generator is being used to provide lighting and, more importantly, power for the salamander heater. Of course, the real challenge under extreme cold conditions is how do you trap the heat in a room, especially if the ceiling space or the roof structure of that room is completely consumed. So you must seal the space as much as possible with whatever materials you have on hand, which might end up being limited to tarps and some wood strapping on top of the actual structure itself. Here you can see flexible ducts directing the heated air from the salamander heater into the closed-in area being heated. Now, it's important to recognize that salamander heaters present a safety concern due to the extreme heat they emit. They have been known to cause fires on job sites and thus need to be watched vigilantly while in operation. In other words, use of this equipment may need a fire watch to be posted 24/7. To the adjuster, this adds costs to the claim. Although diesel or propane fired, as we saw in the previous photo, they also require electrical power, which might necessitate a generator being used. Again, this is going to add a cost to your investigation. As you can see in the photograph, we have ducts at the top of the photograph, allowing hot air to come into the actual room of origin where there is frozen fire debris that we are interested in thawing out for inspection and examination. A more effective system for melting a floor or localized area, although not as readily available, is a glycol ground heater. The heating unit provides a reservoir of glycol which is circulated through hoses that lays down on the floor or in the area that you want to thaw, then returns back to the tank to be reheated. The hoses are sometimes covered with insulation blankets or tarps that help direct the heat back into the ground or the surface being thawed, speeding up the heating process. This really does create an effective way to thaw important evidence in a localized area without having to thaw the entire room. So in this photograph, what you can see is that there is a workbench at one of my scenes. It's in a garage structure. On top of the workbench is a substantial portion of fire debris that's frozen solid. My interest was to thaw this area so that I can examine the fire debris for evidence of a source of ignition for the fire. The ceiling space in this garage had been completely consumed. So our two options is bringing in a salamander heater and hoarding off the ceiling space of this room, or bringing in this glycol ground heater, laying the hoses on the workbench, and allowing the hoses to melt the ice that's on the fire debris. This is a more effective way of doing it. So here is a photograph of a glycol ground heater. As you can see, there is a substantial number of length of hose that can be used to lay down on the ground or in a specific area where you want to thaw the fire debris itself. Now, glycol ground heater is ideal for thawing, but again, it is not typically available in rural areas, and sometimes you have to rely on salamander heaters that are more common in rural areas. Okay, let's talk about the effects of cold on your equipment. So investigating a fire in cold weather also comes with their fair share of minor complications, things that are easy to forget or overlook entirely. While they become a matter of course for one acclimatized to working in such conditions, for the inexperienced, they can be a constant source of frustration and setbacks. This is just as relevant to me as a fire investigator as it will be to you as the field adjuster that is going out to scenes under these extreme cold weather conditions. So for you as a field adjuster, as you examine a scene, keep in mind that cold reduces the capacity of batteries. So if you have a camera, you need to consider how long your batteries might last under cold conditions. Of course, under fire conditions, we all use flashlights. Again, keep in mind that your batteries might not last as long under these cold conditions. If you're still old school or you still dictate your notes like I do, voice recorder will also be impacted by the batteries that are in the voice recorder under cold conditions. For some of you that use laser measuring tools, either contractors or field adjusters, again, batteries in there might be impacted. A lot of field adjusters use tablets and cell phones to take pictures. Again, keep in mind that your batteries may not last as long. So, as the temperatures start to drop, internal resistance in batteries increases and their capacities are reduced. You can buy specially rated cold weather AA or AAA batteries. Now, these will add an extra cost. However, they can be particularly helpful when comparing them to cheaper batteries that may only provide you a short time of service before becoming useless to you. Battery-operated devices should be kept as warm as possible to ensure they operate as efficiently as possible, saving you time and money. Actually, many camera manufacturers designate a minimum temperature, operating temperature for a camera at about 0 degrees Celsius. So extra batteries should be kept in a nice warm location. As an example, what I would typically do is if I need extra batteries for my flashlight or my camera, I'll actually tuck them into my pant pocket underneath my coveralls to keep them warm. Another suggestion I have for you based on my experience is keep a small point and shoot camera inside your jacket just in case your primary camera stops working. Another challenge is when you're moving between cold and warm environments. You typically end up with fogged lenses, the risk of condensation forming inside your camera. So what I would suggest is you may need to place your camera in a sealed plastic bag, possibly a Ziploc bag, to allow it to adjust to warmer temperatures before using again. And an example would be is if you're out in the cold, you're taking some photographs, all of a sudden you decide that you want to go into a warmer climate, let's say your vehicle. As soon as you step into your vehicle, your lens might fog up. So it might take a while for you to be able to go back out and continue taking photographs at a scene. Okay, let's talk about transportation and shelter and your vehicle. While not environmentally friendly, you always should consider keeping your car running in extreme cold weather. Batteries produce less electrical current when it's cold, which can lead to difficulties when trying to start a vehicle after it's been out in cold weather for a long period of time. This is a precarious situation to find yourself in, particularly if you, as a field adjuster or a fire investigator, are working in a remote area, and more particularly if you're on your own. So what I would suggest is try to keep your vehicle running, and this allows for a nice warm place to go to when you're trying to get some rest and warm up. This may not apply to the field adjuster, but relevant to me as a fire investigator. The combination of thick gloves and cold weather makes it difficult to get a grip on tools. This introduces a safety hazard for me when working with an axe or pry bar in a confined space trying to excavate an area of interest. What I typically do, and this is a hint for the field adjusters that may want to use this, is to paint the handles with a granular paint or regular paint mixed with sand at least once annually, just prior to the onset of winter. This will provide extra grip for when I'm working away in the cold at a scene. Making notes and diagrams can be challenging at any time. Gloves, of course, make it difficult to manipulate small instruments. Many pens will not work in the cold, but pencils will. That reminds me of during the space race between the Americans and the Russians. Of course, the Americans were thinking about how the astronauts would make notes, and they developed a pen that is workable in space. My understanding is that it cost about $2 million to create that pen. The Russians, on the other hand, just decided to use pencils up in space. So pencils will work wonders, trust me. I've used them myself. Okay, let's talk about dressing for the elements. For you, the field adjuster, this may seem like a basic piece of information, but it is important for your safety and comfort at a scene, particularly if you're spending some time at the scene scoping the damage that's sustained or looking at the contents. You will always expend more energy because your body is working to stay warm under cold conditions. Tasks require more effort because you are outfitted in bulky clothing and heavy winter boots during cold weather conditions. So you keep in mind, you need to eat properly to maintain both energy and body heat. The other thing is regulate your fluid intake to prevent dehydration. A little known fact is that thirst is suppressed under cold weather environments. You may need to take regular breaks and find a place to stay warm, possibly getting back into your car that's left running for that particular purpose. So again, not environmentally friendly, but it is important that you have a warm place to go to under extreme weather conditions, particularly if you're on your own at a scene. Let's talk more about the different clothing that you might wear at a scene under extreme cold weather. Each layer serves a specific function, protecting the wearer from moisture, cold, wind, and water. So, layers of clothing, the whole purpose is to trap warm air and provide insulation, and allow for flexibility in changing conditions, such as if the temperatures are cold, and then things become warm as you start to work at a scene. Let's talk about your base layer initially. So a base layer should be close-fitting, breathable, quick-drying material. So examples of that material would be a polypropylene, a nylon, rayon, or a merino wool. Cotton, on the other hand, isn't the greatest material because it actually absorbs and retains water. So you really want something that's going to wick your perspiration away and keep you dry. Okay, let's talk about the insulation layer of your clothing. While wool sweater may get the job done, materials such as fleece provide excellent insulation without adding too much weight. However, while wool and fleece are excellent insulators, they offer poor protection against the wind. So a lightweight jacket, synthetic or down insulated, might actually be the answer for you with wind conditions. Another thing is your outer layer, your outerwear. The outer layer may be insulated, but its chief purpose is to make sure that it protects you from wind, rain, and snow. An outer layer shell made of waterproof, breathable materials such as Gore-Tex will allow moisture to escape while repelling water. Again, that makes a huge difference. I notice that in myself when I'm outside and it's windy conditions. If I have a Gore-Tex jacket, it helps with all kinds of weather conditions, including keeping the wind away and keeping me warmer. Let's talk about your footwear. Difficult to overstate the importance of keeping your feet warm and dry. Honestly, I will say that as long as my feet are warm and my footwear is keeping my feet warm, I can last for a long time doing an investigation out in the cold. For me, I find that as long as my feet are warm, I'm able to work for longer periods of time. However, once my feet become cold, I have a difficult time focusing on my work. During an investigation, you're often stationary for long periods of time. So although lighter boots may be suitable when walking around, they may be less effective while standing still for a period of time. Suggest that with the boots, you find an insulator liner or a thick sole to keep you warm. Okay, what I'd like to discuss next is managing expectations. Managing expectations of clients if you're an independent adjuster or a field adjuster. As an example, at the expectations of an insurer. How long it takes to conduct an investigation is something that needs to be addressed under cold weather conditions. The cost associated with the investigation needs to be considered as well. Clients unfamiliar with extreme cold may need to be managed in terms of their expectations on how quickly you can adjust a claim, scope the loss, or conduct an investigation. In my estimation, that a scene could take almost 2 to 3 times longer under cold conditions than it does under summer weather conditions. Everyone works a little slower and everything takes a lot longer. Bulky clothes and heavy boots may make it difficult for you to move around. Again, we talked about batteries dying quickly and need to be replaced. Tools will break. You have to stop and keep warm, taking off and putting multiple layers of clothing each time. I'll give you an example. I was involved in an investigation years ago, and it was taking quite some time to get the investigation going because the building that I was investigating was full of ice from the cold weather conditions. We had clients from the southern US, in fact, from Texas, and they were getting a little concerned about how long it was taking for us to do our investigation. I remember third day in, we had 2 of these individuals fly in from Texas, land at a local remote airport. They rented a car, drove up to the site. They were, of course, not prepared for the extreme cold weather conditions. They got out of the car. They assessed the challenges that we were facing, basically got in the car after 2 hours and decided to head back to Texas, understanding better why it was taking so long for us to do our investigation. So the whole point is we needed to have managed their expectations as well. Okay, I'm going to do a case study now, a fire incident where it was conducted under extreme cold conditions. So let me tell you a bit about this. This is a commercial loss that happened on January 1st of 2018. We were called out to do our scene examination on January 3rd, 2018, so 2 days later. This was a commercial building in northern Manitoba. So here is a photograph. It's the photograph of, again, what I would call an ice castle. It's the remains of the building after fire suppression. So in this case, the fire quickly spread throughout the building, preventing firefighters from entering and conducting an interior attack on the fire. Firefighters used aerial platforms essentially filling the hallways with water following the collapse of the roof. While temperatures at the time were approximately minus 20 degrees C, the water in, on, and around the hotel quickly froze. Here's another photograph of another side of the building. Again, you can see how much ice has formed due to fire suppression activities. We were fortunate that wind speeds rarely exceeded 6 kilometers an hour over the course of the 2 days that we investigated the scene. However, temperatures hovered around minus 32 degrees Celsius and at times reached as low as minus 39 degrees Celsius. It was really cold. Here's another photograph of that same building. You can see that the parking lot outside of the building is full of ice. There is structural collapse, structural consumption of the roof deck, and of course, again, purely an ice castle. Now, in this case, ice made even approaching the structure on foot extremely difficult. The initial survey of the site was conducted while we drove around in an off-road rated four-wheel drive truck. Even attempts to try to walk around on this parking lot to approach the building took a long time just because of the precarious nature of the slip and fall hazard. So getting into the investigation, we had information that a witness reported seeing someone throwing something on a main floor window seconds before the fire started. So we had a fairly good idea where the area of origin was, but gaining access to the room was problematic because of the ice. Now, since this was in a rural area, it was remote in northern Manitoba, we had to consider what kind of equipment to bring in to assist us in creating this thawing process for this frozen ice castle, particularly in the room of interest. We, of course, considered a glycol ground heater, but unfortunately, there wasn't one available to us for several hours away through a rental process. Because we could not wait, we decided on bringing in salamander heaters and creating these thawing conditions through that process. All of the water inside the hotel, again, had frozen, and the pressure from the expanding ice had even burst open the front doors to this commercial building, which, as it turns out, to be a motel. We, of course, had to bring in some heavy equipment to assist us. An excavator was brought in from a local mining site to help peel back the exterior wall from the suspected room of origin. So in this photograph, you can see that the excavator was brought in because otherwise there was no way of being able to peel back the walls to allow us to conduct our investigation into the cause of this fire. With the help of the excavator, we were able to remove exterior walls from the abutting rooms to the area of origin where the fire had not entered in order to get a better idea of the layout of the room. So in the photograph, you can see that on the left side is a motel room that was undamaged by fire. Of course, the roof structure above it is completely consumed. And on the right side of the photograph is the room of origin. It's the room, the motel room, where the fire damage was quite severe and the area of interest to us as fire investigators. So you'll note that on the floor of this room, on the right side, there is a substantial portion of fire debris, all frozen solid. And it is debris that we needed to go through to determine the cause of the fire and debris that we had to thaw out. So this is a photograph of the room of origin. As you can see, we've placed tarps to close off the room. We brought in a salamander heater, and you can see that there is flexible ducts that have been put into the room, allowing the heat generated by the salamander heater to be brought into the room, resulting in the thawing process. We estimate that there was about 3 feet of frozen debris from the collapse of the ceiling above, which needed to be cleared before we can investigate further. The salamander heater ran for 2 full days, during which time we removed layers of debris with pry bars as the debris started to thaw out slowly. Wiring and the remains of some of the furnishings within the room can be seen in this photograph after we were able to excavate the debris once the room had been thawed. So you can see on the floor there's various segments of wiring that we had to examine to make sure that there is no evidence of electrical failures. We went through looking for furnishings, the remains of springs from couches and beds, and looked for any equipment such as light fixtures, that sort of thing, just to determine whether they were involved in the cause of the fire. When we reached the floor, the top-down patterns on the floor under the window confirmed to us that this indeed was the room of origin. Based on the fire patterns, the fire spread through the ceiling of room 105 in this motel into the hallway corridor ceiling via a construction feature that created a void space between the drywall ceiling. And from the hallway ceiling, it spread throughout the entire building in inaccessible areas, making it difficult for the fire department to suppress the fire. The cause of this fire was identified as being incendiary act involving an ignitable liquid. We suspect, based on eyewitness reports and based on our investigation, that a device such as a Molotov cocktail was thrown in through a window of this motel room, resulting in an incendiary fire in the motel room, which then broke out into the ceiling space and across the roof structure of the entire building, causing extensive damage and a total loss. Some of the extensive damage that was sustained was in part because of the cold weather conditions at that time and the difficulty and challenges faced by the fire department in suppressing the fire. In many ways, performing a fire investigation in cold weather is no different than in warm weather. A client asks you to investigate the origin and cause of a fire. You travel to the scene, examine the building, take photos and notes, conduct interviews, document and remove evidence for a closer inspection, and finally arrive at a conclusion after analyzing all of the information. Whether the temperature is minus 40 degrees Celsius or 40 degrees Celsius, the same steps must be undertaken and the same procedures followed. In that respect, the cold makes no difference. However, the cold does make everything more difficult, complicated, time-consuming, and of course, more costly, which can lead to a frustration and poor decision-making. So I would say that more than ever, under extreme cold weather conditions, proper planning is essential for a successful scene examination and fire investigation.
All right, thank you very much, Mazen. That concludes the lecturing part of the webinar. Now we're going to jump into the Q&A portion. As I'd mentioned before, please submit your questions in the GoToWebinar tab that's on your screen in the questions section. And we hope to get to all the questions. We have a few already that have been submitted, so we're just going to have a very informal kind of discussion. So, Mazen, one question that's come in is pertaining to, I believe, is pertaining to the case study that you just went through. One of them, the question says, why would the fire marshal determine the cause? Is that related to, did you mention the fire marshal in that last?
No, I don't believe I did. But I mean, essentially, anytime there is a fire investigation conducted, if the local authority is the fire marshal, it is incumbent on them to determine the cause of this fire.
Great, thank you. Another question pertaining to that hotel fire that you were mentioning. Were you able to collect samples for ignitable liquids from the origin room? How did you identify areas to sample?
Okay, so in that case, we did take samples. The samples were, again, this is a small room, so it wouldn't have been very difficult. We were able to identify areas where there is more fire damage close to the floor. We actually took several samples, submitted them to a lab, and got the results from the lab that came back with a positive presence of a flammable or combustible liquid.
Great. Next question. How are you securing the evidence when it is encased in ice? Do you use storage at a fire station, for example?
So there's several ways that we do this. I mean, it's essentially depending on how much of your area needs to be taken out. We've gone as far as using chainsaws, sawzalls to cut out specific areas. Of course, it's important to make sure that you use the right piece of equipment. So in the case of this motel, if we were going to cut out anything with a chainsaw or a sawzall, one thing you don't want to do is go in with gasoline powered equipment. For obvious reasons, you don't want cross contamination in case you are taking samples for evidence of an arson. So you would have to use electrical equipment. In that case, you would cut out certain sections that you would need. You would cart them off to some place that's, let's say, of course, got warm conditions. In remote areas, sometimes it's going to the fire hall. In other areas, it's going to some a garage. We've used contractors' warehouses. It depends where you are and what's available to you. But the whole point is to take it to an area where you can actually warm up the part that you've actually cut out so that you can examine it for evidence of a cause for the fire.
Thank you. Next question. How often do you have access to a glycol ground heater equipment, and is it costly?
Good question. So in most city centers, most large towns, you'll find a rental place that will actually be able to rent out a glycol ground heater. A lot of construction companies use them to cure concrete. That's the whole purpose of them. What I would say is that, of course, it's going to be a lot more costly to rent than a salamander heater, but the time savings will more than offset the cost of the rental for the glycol ground heater. So to me, it's a very effective way. There are instances where a salamander heater will just not work. It will take far too long. Again, if the heat is escaping because the roof structure is completely consumed and you can't keep the heat in, then your only choice is to try and use a glycol ground heater.
Okay, next question. Will the glycol hoses change the landscape? Sorry, give me a sec. Will the glycol hoses change the landscape they're sitting on as they melt, and how does that affect the actual investigation and information obtained after the melting?
Actually, what we typically do is we lay the hoses in a very specific structure. So the hoses themselves, all they do is they're just warm to the touch. And as the top surface of your fire debris starts to melt, the hoses, because of gravity and their weight, start to work their way into the actual fire debris. They provide no impact on the actual condition of the debris itself once thawed. And it's a very effective way to make sure that you can actually provide very localized and impactful heat in the area that you're concerned about.
Great. Getting a lot of questions. Thank you all for chiming in here. Next question. Why would anyone in their right mind be alone in this type of cold?
Well, good question. And unfortunately, I can admit to being alone in this cold myself. In fact, the incident I told you where I actually fell through the ice in the basement, it was early morning. For those of you that know me, I like to start early in the mornings. I was in the Niagara region. I fell through the ice, and The one thing is trying to get out of the ice and make it to the car. I was on my own and I was thinking, okay, I needed to figure out a way to get changed. And luckily, I always keep clothes, like dry clothes, in my car. Um, I would not advise it if you're actually going out to a really far rural area that's secluded. One should not be on their own, especially under these kinds of cold, extreme conditions.
Thank you, Mazen. Next question. How are you securing the evidence when it is encased, or sorry, that was a previous one. Can you please give examples and brands of clothing that we could purchase?
I'm not actually not going to get into any brands, but what I would say is, all kinds of clothing, as long as you look at the synthetic materials, are probably best. Um, there's a lot of course, stores available that will sell you equipment or clothing that is good for weather conditions. I mean, I'm not going to talk about any brands for obvious reasons, but they're available everywhere. I mean, even your local hardware store will provide you with advice on the kind of clothing that you may need for cold weather conditions.
Okay, next question. Do you pack crampons for walking on ice?
I actually have used them in the past. I've also got these slip-on ice walkers that I've used in the past as well. Again, it's a matter of taking your time, making sure that you're walking on ice in a way that you're not going to slip and fall. But the reality is, there isn't just the ice that you have to worry about. It's not just what's on the ground. It's what's above you in a building. It's other reasons. Again, you're going to fall through the ice or not fall through the ice. But of course, I have used those shoes in the past.
Okay, next question. What causes a fire would an insurer exclude?
Okay, repeat that question again, George.
What causes a fire would an insurer exclude?
Well, I think that's probably a better question answered by an adjuster.
Or even an underwriter.
Or an underwriter or an examiner.
We have another question that's kind of related. Do you see any trends in claims in such extreme cold and their causes? I mean, you wouldn't want to just exclude, I don't know, I'm not an underwriter myself, but you wouldn't want to just exclude whatever is most common, but do you see any commonalities between these extreme locations, these very cold areas, and causes? Like,
I think just by the nature of the weather conditions, of course, one thing that you need to investigate the possibility of is a cause of a fire due to the heating systems. Typically, people, of course, under extreme cold weather conditions, they want to make sure that their homes and their offices and their buildings are heated. If a furnace breaks down, they would use electric heat. That introduces the possibility of an electric heater causing a fire. It introduces the possibility of an overload on wiring because of use of an electric heat. So there's lots of reasons. But I mean, generally, under cold weather conditions, something that you really need to think about is the heating of the building.
Great. Next question. Are canines still used in cold weather investigations? If so, other than the obvious challenge, it being cold for the animal, what other challenges are posed?
Excellent question. So we've utilized our canine under very extreme cold weather conditions. I can tell you these animals are amazing. I remember years ago doing a fire in southwestern Ontario. It was in an old school building turned into a restaurant. And there must have been about, I'd say, 4 or 5 feet of ice on the ground. There was a suspicion that this was an intentional act. We actually brought in our canine. Our actual scene investigation was conducted about a month after the fact. We brought in our canine. The canine went through and indicated on 3 or 4 different areas. It took us about 3 to 4 days to thaw out the area. And at the bottom of the frozen ice, we found several gas cans. So the canines will work. Cold weather, it's not something that's very impactful for them. A lot of these dogs are, they basically live outside so they can build a thick coat so that they can actually work under cold conditions. Of course, the thing that you have to watch is the footing. You have to make sure that they're just as safe because of falling ice and falling through the ice into the water as a human being would be.
That was a great question. Next, will the process of melting the ice cause a dilution of the ignitable liquids? Does the process of collection and storage change?
It depends. Of course, if you're talking about something like alcohol or acetone that dissolves in water, that may be impacted by the thawing process. But if you're talking about a hydrocarbon such as gasoline or paint thinner or kerosene, that's not typically impacted by water itself. So no, it's not something that is going to impact our investigation. The thawing process just allows us to get into being able to see fire debris that's not frozen to see if there is anything other than the fact that there might have been a combustible liquid or an accelerant used.
Great. Someone just commented, this was not mentioned, but thought would be good info. Always take a pencil and paper with you and do not rely on battery equipment only. So you did touch on that with the whole Russia versus United States space race. So can you tell us, other than having a pencil and paper, like what other non-battery equipment do you think that we can be brought with you? Or is it as simple as bringing backups, like as you said, bring a point and shoot above and beyond, like a backup camera essentially?
Yeah, I think listen, it's a great idea to have a backup camera regardless because technology will fail at some point. So if you're at a scene 2 hours away from your office, for example, the last thing you want to do is have to go back and take more pictures. Always have a backup camera with you. The other thing is, batteries can be managed. Again, put things in your pocket to keep them nice and warm. I dictate all my notes at a scene. So I use my dictation unit. I'll make my notes, put my dictation unit back into my pocket so it keeps it nice and warm. I find that for the most part, unless it's out there for a long period of time, it doesn't pose an issue for me. My dictation unit will continue to work for me as I need it.
Great, thank you. Regarding a commercial or industrial risk, is there any situation where heating is impossible, like when chemicals are involved in the premises, for example?
Of course, we always have to assess the risk. We also always have to assess what it is that we are actually heating. If there are chemicals that we need to sort of consider, it may be to the point where some of these chemicals, if possible, need to be removed from the site and the area that you're concerned about then cordoned off so that it can be heated and the ice thawed out. Again, not all scenes are built equally and not all solutions are the same for every scene.
Great. Do you find that when the fire department or fire marshal's office releases the property that continuity is broken, and does that cause doubt to your findings by your customers?
That's a great question. Of course, it's a question we wrestle with all the time. It depends. It depends how the fire department or the fire marshal have released the scene. Of course, We hope that when the scene has been released, the insurance company or the adjuster have made sure that there is security on site, or that the scene has been released back to the insurers or the adjuster so that continuity can be maintained. It's very important that, a lot of times you keep in touch with the fire department or the fire marshal to make sure you know when they're going to release a scene so that you can arrange for security to be there. Because otherwise, if there is a time period that the scene has been released, let's say back to the owner's walked away from the scene, and you've asked for an investigation to be conducted the next morning, overnight, while the scene has been unsecured, there is a question of continuity of evidence and whether that continuity has been maintained.
Great. Is the cost of the equipment needed to do a scene examination, such as a salamander heater or the glycol heater, included as part of your fee, or is this the responsibility of the adjuster to coordinate? How do we know what you need for a scene exam, especially in a remote location?
Good question. Okay, so what I would say is that it is typically an arrangement that's made either through the adjuster or through contractors retained by the adjuster. Again, I believe that every fire investigation is a team effort. It's a team effort between your investigator, your contractors, the adjuster, the insurance examiners. And so for us, what we would typically do is assess what we need. We have a discussion with the adjuster or the contractors, and then a plan is put into place on how to help us achieve the process of conducting our investigation. But I would say typically we go through contractors retained by the insurance company to provide us with the equipment needed to conduct our investigation.
We are approaching the concluded time, scheduled time, but we're going to roll through because there's a few more questions. I just want to let you guys know, if you do have something scheduled at this time and you need to drop off, that's no problem. We're going to be sending you guys completion certificates within the next few days, just verifying that you had attended the webinar. Also, when you close the webinar screen, you're going to be prompted to answer 5 very short questions just about the content of this seminar, what you thought about it, how you think Mazen did. We would really appreciate if you can just take a couple of seconds to input that information, because we'd love to get your feedback to better refine our seminars in the future. I'm going to get back into, we only have like maybe 4 more questions, so let's get back into it. So, wouldn't a salamander heater be more effective since you can also see the surroundings of the location or the seat of the fire and get further evidence, and also probably the pattern of fire throughout the room?
Yes and no. I mean, so the difference is that with a ground glycol heater, you've got your hoses running along the floors, for example. The whole point is that you provide heat to thaw the place out. There have been instances where we've taken the hoses out, we've excavated a little, looked at the patterns, and then put the hoses back to continue with our thawing out process. The disadvantage of a salamander heater, although they do work, is that they take time because they're not necessarily heating up the floor space. They're heating up the space in the room itself. So there's a lot of heat wasted heating up the actual space above the floor, which then radiates down into the floor and causes the thawing process. Both work. One is more localized, the other one's more general and just takes more time.
Great. With the motel example, was the arsonist caught?
Yes, there was an individual that was arrested a few days later. I don't have the particulars. Of course, as a fire investigator, it's not something we really concern ourselves with, but there was an arrest made.
Great. Not a question, but merely a comment regarding a couple of things. Number one, regarding the boots or shoes in use on a site like this, I would suggest it would be prudent, if not required by WSIB, to wear CAS or UI or ULC certified footwear similar to what a construction worker would be required to wear. The second point that they mentioned was if attending a scene alone, as referred to a number of times, it would be suggested also to inform a reliable and accessible person or persons and make sure that there's a regular I'm okay check-in time to connect with each other. Great points. Next question is, how long did the Ice Castle investigation take, and could you discuss how you communicated on projected costs, budgets to the adjusters or the examiner?
Okay, well, it actually, the investigation itself took about 3 to 4 days because we had to assess the condition of the building. We had to bring in structural engineers that then assessed how safe the building is to work in. Then a plan of attack was formulated to thaw the one area of concern. In terms of the costing, I think the best way to do it is to make sure that the independent adjuster or the road adjuster or the field adjuster is present at all times, just so that they can understand what's taking so long, what kind of equipment is required, the cost of the rentals. Again, this is a team effort and requires the input of both the adjuster, the investigator, and the contractor that's assisting in supplying this equipment to you.
Great. Another question here. Hi, I'm a fire investigator with Calgary Fire, and we work quite closely with your local forensic experts and share as much as we are able, but I know each province is different, and in Ontario, the provincial investigators do not allow insurance fire investigators access until they are done. In this fire, did you work with them or were you only allowed in afterwards? Are there times when the scenes have too much overhaul conducted and the provincial or local investigators have almost contaminated the scene too much?
In the case of our investigation in northern Manitoba, due to costs, the local authorities could not conduct an investigation on their own. So there was a cooperation between the insurance investigators and the local investigators. It was conducted in conjunction with one another. I would say that for the most part, depending on the actual background information, depending on the investigation itself, there is times when the insurance investigators are allowed on site to conduct an investigation alongside with the public investigators. Under some conditions, when I know in Ontario, for example, if the investigation conducted by the public authority is done under a search warrant, the insurance investigators are not permitted to be on site until the public investigators have completed their investigation.
Great. In the case study, would the route the fire used to spread, being through a ceiling and into a space in a hallway, have been an error in construction methods which could have drawn the contractor or architect or building inspector into liability for the extent of loss?
Again, that's a good question, and it's a question that needs to be answered after the investigation has been conducted. We were only involved in conducting the origin and cause investigation into how the fire started and why. Beyond that, I'm sure the insurers retained structural engineers to assess the condition of the building, how the building was constructed, and whether it met code or not.
Which would determine the answer to that question.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
I think the spirit of your question, I guess it is a great question, and it is certainly something that is evaluated and discussed because when it comes to liability and subrogation, those are matters that certainly should be addressed. Next question. Have you ever tried using heat vests or heated shoes?
Interesting. Yes, I have used a heated vest. Again, they're great. They interestingly don't provide a lot of heat, but just enough so that you're not actually feeling a lot of cold on the inside. Again, In my case, I typically forget to recharge my batteries for these heated vests. So after using it a couple of times, your batteries are depleted, and if you just have to remember to recharge your batteries, then you're okay. But they actually do work. I haven't used any heated boots, no.
Okay, great. Last question. I wonder how to separate the damages due to the frozen water after the fire and any pre-existent damages? Question mark. It was a question posed in a statement.
Yeah, I think that would be difficult. Again, it's a question of the totality of the damage sustained, whether some of it is due to the fire itself, whether some of it is due to fire suppression or overhaul activities, or whether it's just, again, due to the building collapsing because of the weight of the ice that's formed on the building due to fire suppression. But good question.
Great. That concludes all the questions. Thank you so much. They're great questions. Thank you all for joining us. We'll make sure to get a completion certificate to you. In the event that you're sitting in a group and you're not signed in yourself, make sure to email us at webinar@origin-and-cause.com, and we'll make sure you just provide us with your name, email address, your contact information, and we'll make sure to get those completion certificates sent to you right away. Thank you again for tuning in, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.